Let me ask you something that I genuinely think deserves more attention than it has received anywhere in the Formula One media landscape. What if the most decorated driver in the history of this sport, a man with 7 world championships, over 100 race victories, and a record that may genuinely never be matched, joined the most iconic team in motorsport history, and it almost completely fell apart? Not because of anything dramatic, not because of some spectacular crash or a public fallout or a scandal, but simply because, according to reports and the man himself, nobody was actually listening to him. That is not a dramatic oversimplification. That is, based on everything that has come out in recent weeks, a fairly accurate summary of Lewis Hamilton's first year inside Ferrari. And 2026, the year that was supposed to be uncertain, chaotic, the great unknown with brand new regulations arriving across the entire grid, has instead become the year where something inside Ferrari appears to have fundamentally shifted. But here is what I want to dig into today. Because it is not just that Ferrari improved, it is the specific way they improved. It is the innovations they brought to the 2026 car that other teams are now scrambling to copy. It is the internal cultural change that Hamilton has been describing in his own words. And perhaps most intriguingly of all, there is the question of how much of this transformation is directly traceable back to one man standing in a garage in Maranello telling engineers things they did not necessarily want to hear. Stick with me through this, because there are layers to this story that the quick headlines simply do not capture. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why what is happening at Ferrari right now might be one of the most significant storylines of the entire 2026 season, regardless of where the championship standings end up at the end of the year. Let us start where the story really begins, which is not the moment Hamilton signed for Ferrari, but rather the moment he arrived and started actually trying to work within the team. By December 2024, the announcement had already sent shockwaves through the sport. Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, leaving Mercedes, the team that had dominated an era of Formula One so completely that it reshaped what people believed was possible in this sport, and joining Ferrari. The symbolism alone was overwhelming. This is the team of Niki Lauda, of Michael Schumacher, of the entire mythology of Italian racing passion. And Hamilton, the man who rewrote the record books at Mercedes, was going to add his chapter to that story. The press conferences were electric. The merchandise sold out. Everyone had an opinion. And then 2025 began, and within the first few months of the actual season, it became increasingly apparent that the fairy tale and the reality were operating in very different dimensions. Because what Hamilton reportedly discovered when he got into the actual work of being a Ferrari driver was that the 2025 car had essentially been designed and locked into production before he had any meaningful involvement in its creation. Think about that from his perspective. You are Lewis Hamilton. You have spent over a decade at Mercedes building cars around your specific feedback, your specific driving style, your specific demands for how a Formula One car should behave. And now you are sitting in a machine that was built around a philosophy you had no part in shaping, which, according to various reports, carried a significant redesign of the front suspension package that arguably needed considerably more development runway before it was ready to be raced at the highest level. That is a very particular kind of frustration. It is not just the frustration of a slow car. It is the frustration of knowing exactly what questions to ask and having no mechanism through which those questions can produce real answers. And in a sport as precise and unforgiving as Formula One, that kind of disconnect between a driver's knowledge and a team's output does not stay hidden for long. And here is the part of the 2025 story that I think tells you the most about the internal dynamics at Ferrari at that time. According to reports, and most importantly according to Hamilton's own accounts, he spent a significant portion of last year pushing for specific changes, asking specific questions, and advocating for specific innovations, and consistently hitting what he himself described as a wall. He used a very specific phrase in his recent comments. He said he was shouting from the top of the mountain. Now, I want you to really sit with that image for a moment. This is Lewis Hamilton, a man whose voice in a technical debrief carries the weight of 7 world championships and decades of elite-level feedback. A man who helped develop the most dominant Formula One car packages in the sport's modern era at Mercedes. And he is describing his experience at Ferrari in 2025 as shouting and not being heard. That is a genuinely remarkable admission. And it tells you something not just about Ferrari's internal processes at that time, but also about the particular challenge of integrating a driver of Hamilton's experience and opinions into a team that has its own deeply entrenched ways of working. Ferrari is not just a Formula One team, it's a 100-year-old institution with a culture as thick as concrete. Changing the way it thinks, the way it works, the way it responds to driver feedback, that is not something that happens in a few months. And Hamilton, for all of his greatness, reportedly had to learn that the hard way in 2025. But the relationship between him and his race engineering setup also reportedly needed significant attention. His pairing with Riccardo Adami, an experienced and respected engineer
who had worked closely with Sebastian Vettel during his Ferrari years, was not, by most accounts, producing the kind of symbiotic working relationship that Hamilton needed to perform at his best. Ferrari, to their credit, or perhaps to their communications strategy, spent most of 2025 publicly downplaying any suggestion that there was friction on Hamilton's side of the garage. But the fact that the situation has since been resolved, with Adami stepping back and Carlo Santi now filling the race engineer role, suggests that whatever Ferrari was saying publicly, the private assessment of the situation was considerably more candid. And honestly, that is not necessarily a criticism of either Adami or the team. Sometimes 2 genuinely talented people in a high-pressure environment simply do not click the way everyone hoped. It does not mean anyone failed. It means someone had the intelligence to recognize a mismatch and act on it. That is actually a sign of organizational maturity, even if it took longer to happen than Hamilton might have preferred. And here is where the story takes a turn that genuinely matters, because Hamilton's description of Carlo Santi is not the kind of thing you say about someone who is just doing an adequate job. Hamilton has reportedly referred to Santi as the Italian Bono. For those who might not immediately recognize the reference, Pete Bonington, known universally in the paddock as Bono, was Hamilton's race engineer throughout the Mercedes dynasty years. 6 world championships were won with Bonington's voice in Hamilton's ear, managing race strategy, managing the psychological rhythm of a race weekend, managing the incredibly complex real-time communication between driver and team that can make or lose tenths of a second. That relationship was considered by many observers to be one of the most effective driver-engineer partnerships in the sport's modern history. So when Hamilton calls his new Ferrari race engineer the Italian Bono, he is not paying a casual compliment. He is signaling that this new relationship operates at a similar level of trust, communication, and mutual understanding. And in Formula One, where so much of what separates good from great comes down to exactly those intangibles, that signal matters enormously. The relationship between a driver and his race engineer is not just logistical, it is psychological. It is the difference between a driver who goes into a difficult stint feeling supported and calm, and a driver who goes into that same stint feeling uncertain and disconnected from his team. Hamilton has clearly found in Santi something that was missing in 2025, and that shift alone, even setting aside every other variable, would have made a measurable difference to his performance and his engagement with the team throughout the early part of 2026. When you strip away all the aerodynamics and the technical jargon, this is, at its core, a story about communication, about what happens when the right people are finally in the right conversations together. But the race-engineer relationship, as important as it is only one piece of the transformation that appears to have taken place at Ferrari heading into 2026. The larger and arguably more significant shift has been in the team's technical philosophy. And this is where Hamilton's account of his 2025 advocacy becomes particularly interesting, because the evidence for that advocacy having made a real impact is sitting right there on track for everyone to see.
Ferrari arrived at the start of 2026 season with a car that contains several aerodynamic concepts that are, by the standards of contemporary Formula One, genuinely unusual. The most attention-grabbing of these is what the paddock has nicknamed the Macarena wing. Now, if you have not followed the technical coverage closely, let me paint you a picture of what this actually means. Ferrari's 2026 rear wing mechanism does not simply stall or flatten in the conventional way that most active aerodynamic systems work when a car switches into low drag mode on a straight. Instead, according to reports and technical analysis, the Ferrari system involves the wing rotating, physically flipping upside down in order to dump drag as aggressively and efficiently as possible. The name Macarena reportedly came from inside the Ferrari garage itself, where someone apparently decided the wing's flipping motion reminded them of the famous 1990s dance that involves a sequence of arm and body rotations. And honestly, as a nickname for a Formula One aerodynamic component, that is both completely absurd and entirely endearing, which is also very on-brand for Ferrari in a way that I genuinely appreciate. But here is the thing about that wing beyond the entertaining nickname. Other teams have looked at it. Other teams are reportedly studying it seriously, because in the context of 2026's active aerodynamics regulations, where managing the transition between high downforce cornering mode and low drag straight line mode is a critical performance differentiator, Ferrari's approach may represent a genuinely clever solution to a problem that every team on the grid is trying to solve. That is not a team following the pack, that is a team leading it. And Hamilton's own comments make it clear that this kind of technical boldness was something he had been pushing Ferrari toward for the entirety of 2025. Hearing him say, Ferrari should be the innovators, they should be the ones that all the teams are trying to copy, and then watching the paddock actually copy Ferrari's concepts within a few months of the season beginning, that is a narrative arc with a satisfying shape to it. Ferrari has also reportedly deployed another significant innovation in its 2026 car, in the form of winglets mounted within the exhaust exit area. Aerodynamic components interacting with exhaust flow is a technical territory that Formula One has visited before in different forms and in different regulatory eras, but the specific implementation that Ferrari has brought to 2026 appears to have been considered sufficiently clever and effective that, according to various reports, other teams are reportedly studying it seriously.
Almost the entire grid has now found ways to incorporate similar concepts into their own designs. When the majority of the teams in the most technically sophisticated racing series in the world look at what you have done and immediately try to replicate it, you are not just doing something right, you are doing something that has redefined what right looks like. And while it would be an oversimplification to suggest that this is entirely a consequence of Hamilton's advocacy, the timeline of his pushing Ferrari to innovate in 2025 and Ferrari showing up in 2026 with concepts that other teams are copying is not a coincidence that should be dismissed lightly. Hamilton himself, to his credit, has not overstated his personal role in driving these changes. His comments have been measured and genuinely collaborative in tone. He has acknowledged the collaborative nature of what has happened and given clear credit to Ferrari team principal Fred Vasseur for being genuinely receptive and responsive to the working relationship they have been trying to build together over the past year and a half. But the broad direction of what Hamilton was asking for, Ferrari being the innovators, Ferrari being the team that others follow rather than followed, and the broad direction of what Ferrari has actually delivered in 2026 are clearly and unmistakably aligned. Now, I want to be careful here, because this story could very easily tip into something that misrepresents where Ferrari actually stands in the competitive picture of 2026. And a responsible account of this situation has to acknowledge the gaps as clearly as it acknowledges the progress. Hamilton has been quite direct in his assessment that Ferrari still needs more overall downforce to start consistently challenging Mercedes at the front of the field. Mercedes, by most accounts, and based on the early season results and commentary from within the paddock, has emerged from the winter looking extremely strong. And when Hamilton, who knows what a championship-winning car feels like from the inside better than almost anyone alive, says Ferrari is not yet at that level on a consistent basis, you should believe him. That is not a criticism of Ferrari's effort or direction. It is an honest technical assessment from the man best positioned in the world to make it. And one of the things I personally find refreshing about Hamilton's recent media presence is that he has not shied away from that honesty, even when it would have been easier and more comfortable to simply say everything is perfect. Ferrari has also been granted development opportunities through the ADU regulatory framework, which allows teams to develop certain aspects of their cars within a structured and monitored system during the season. But sources within the paddock suggest that any meaningful improvements to Ferrari's power unit, which is also a critical variable in the 2026 performance equation, given that the new power unit regulations have shifted the balance of contribution between the engine and the hybrid system in significant ways, will carry a substantially longer development timeline than Ferrari fans might be hoping for. You cannot shortcut engine development. The material science, the thermodynamics, the mechanical engineering, these things move at their own pace, regardless of how urgently you need results or how many press releases you issue about your ambitions. So the honest picture of Ferrari in 2026 is a team that has made genuine and significant progress in its aerodynamic innovation and its internal culture, but still has technical ground to close on the championship leaders, and still has development lead times that will limit how quickly some of that ground can be closed within this current campaign. What I find personally compelling about all of this, and here is my genuine take, not just a neutral summary of events, is the specific nature of the transformation that Hamilton has been part of at Ferrari. Because what he is describing is not simply a driver who got a better car and therefore performed better. What he is describing is something considerably more interesting than that. He is describing the process of embedding himself into a team's culture deeply enough that his feedback starts to shape not just how the car is set up for a given race weekend, but how the engineering team thinks about problems, how the design group approaches challenges, what the overall technical philosophy of the organization looks like going forward. That is an unusual level of influence for a driver to have over a Formula One team's technical direction, and frankly, not every driver in the paddock would even want that responsibility. But for Hamilton, who has spoken repeatedly about his desire to have a real and meaningful impact on the team he is part of, this appears to be exactly the role he was looking for when he made the decision to leave Mercedes. And what 2025 apparently demonstrated is that when that level of technical engagement cannot find a productive outlet within a team's established processes, it doesn't just create frustration for the driver, it creates a measurable performance ceiling that affects the entire team's output. Conversely, what 2026 appears to be demonstrating is that when that engagement is welcomed, acted upon, and allowed to influence real decisions in real time, the results start to show up both in the car's design on the track and in the driver's mentality and performance during race weekends. The two things reinforce each other in a positive cycle. And that reinforcing dynamic is what makes the Hamilton-Ferrari story in 2026 genuinely worth following as a narrative that extends well beyond lap times and championship standings. Let us also consider the broader Formula One context that frames all of this, because the 2026 regulation reset is not a small thing, and its implications for the competitive order cannot be understated. This is one of the most comprehensive regulatory overhauls the sport has seen
in a very long time, touching both power unit regulations and aerodynamic philosophy simultaneously, with active aerodynamics becoming a standard feature across the entire grid for the first time in the modern era. What regulation resets do, historically, is create genuine opportunities for teams that might have been locked into a performance disadvantage under the old rules to close the gap or even leap ahead entirely. The 2009 regulation reset produced Braun GP's championship. The 2014 reset gave Mercedes a 6-year stranglehold on the sport. The 2022 reset opened a window for Red Bull to build their dominant stretch. Each of these moments was defined by which team read the new regulations most accurately and most boldly.
Ferrari, with its significant investment in the 2026 project, the team reportedly diverted substantial development resources away from the 2025 car very early in that season, as far back as April, precisely in order to maximize their preparation for this new regulatory era. Is clearly a team that has made a serious bet on getting this transition right. The Macarena wing, the exhaust winglets, the reported improvements to Hamilton's working environment and engineering relationships, all of these are components of that bet being placed. And while the early returns suggest the bet is directionally correct, the full payout, if it comes, will only arrive at the end of a very long and grueling season. Formula One championships are not won in press conferences or in technical briefings or in optimistic spring assessments. They're won across 20-plus race weekends on circuits that span every continent and every condition. And that is where Ferrari's 2026 story still has its most important chapters yet to be written. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to address before I wrap up, because it speaks to something that does not get discussed enough in the Formula One conversation around Lewis Hamilton and what his presence at Ferrari actually means in the long term. Hamilton has spoken in his recent comments about trying to galvanize the troops, his phrase, inside Ferrari, about going to the factory and seeing a love for the team that he says he has never witnessed anywhere else in his career. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is a remarkable statement from a remarkable source. Lewis Hamilton spent over a decade at Mercedes. He watched from the inside as that team built one of the most statistically dominant stretches in the sport's history. He knows what a winning culture looks like from the inside because he lived in one for years. And yet here he is at Ferrari, a team that has not won a Constructors' Championship since 2008, saying the level of passion he sees in the people working there is beyond anything he has previously encountered. That is either a very polished public relations line, or it is a genuinely meaningful observation about what exists inside Maranello waiting to be channeled correctly. Based on everything else Hamilton has said about his situation, including the candid acknowledgement of the difficulties of 2025, the honest assessment of the downforce gap to Mercedes, the straightforward admission that there is still significant work to do, I'm inclined to take it as the latter. This does not read like a man working through a rehearsed media script. It reads like someone who has genuinely found something unexpected and is trying to describe it accurately. And that raises a question that I think will define Hamilton's legacy at Ferrari, regardless of how many races he wins or championships he contends for. Can he be the person who transforms that passion into sustained, systematic excellence? Because passion without structure is enthusiasm without results. Ferrari has had plenty of passionate moments in its modern history. What it has struggled with, according to various analysts and paddock observers over the years, is converting that passion consistently into the kind of cold, calculated, relentless execution that championship campaigns require. Hamilton's comments about directing and steering the team's energy suggest that he sees this as part of his role, that he understands the difference between a team that wants to win and a team that knows how to win, and that he is actively trying to help Ferrari make that transition. Whether he succeeds in that ambition, whether the team's culture proves capable of absorbing that level of directional influence from a driver, and whether the results on track reflect the work being done behind the scenes, these are the questions that the remainder of the 2026 season, and indeed the years beyond it, will answer. Fred Vasseur, for his part, has reportedly been a genuinely collaborative partner in this process. Hamilton's acknowledgement of Vasseur's support, his willingness to make certain changes that Hamilton had been pushing for, his openness to a working dynamic that gives the driver a meaningful voice in technical direction, suggests a team principal who understands that getting the most out of this particular driver requires a different kind of engagement than Ferrari may have offered its previous champions. And that alignment at the leadership level between Vasseur and Hamilton may ultimately prove to be as important to Ferrari's 2026 story as any specific aerodynamic innovation or engineering upgrade. So where does this leave us? According to the latest reports, Ferrari has been granted 2 upgrades through the ADUO system. For those who don't follow the technical regulations closely, that's significant. It means the governing body has recognized that Ferrari has room to improve and has given them permission to do so. But here's the catch. Any developments to the powertrain are expected to have a much longer lead time. According to sources, Ferrari isn't going to magically find half a second overnight. This is a marathon, not a sprint, and Hamilton knows it.
He said repeatedly that there's still a huge amount of work to do, still improvements to make, still a long road ahead before Ferrari is consistently challenging Mercedes at the front. But here's what gives me hope. Hamilton says he's more aligned with Ferrari than ever before. He says the foundation is solid. He says the team is finally innovating in ways that other teams are trying to copy. And he says there's a lot more innovation coming. Not maybe, not hopefully. According to him, there is a lot more innovation coming, which is really exciting. That's not the language of someone who's given up. That's the language of someone who sees the finish line, even if it's still far away. And honestly, that's the kind of energy that wins championships. Not the energy of perfection, not the energy of having everything figured out, but the energy of progress, of alignment, of a team and a driver pulling in the same direction. So here's my final thought on all of this. Watch Ferrari for the rest of 2026, not because they're going to win every race. According to the reports, they probably won't. But watch them because you're witnessing something transform in real time. A 7-time champion who found his voice again, a legendary team that remembered how to innovate, and a partnership that after a rocky start might just be getting started. According to Hamilton, it took a full year to get to know each other, a full year of frustration and shouting and banging heads against walls. But now they're more aligned than ever before. And if history tells us anything, that's exactly when the magic happens. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about Ferrari's 2026 design. Do you think the Macarena wing is genius or gimmick? And do you believe Hamilton can actually challenge for another championship with this team? I'll be reading your responses.